So it's my privilege and pleasure to introduce our next panel and moderator. So Kush Parmar, known to many of you as the co-managing director of 5AM Ventures, leading early stage biotech fund. Kush, before joining the venture world, was a physician scientist sponsored by the NIH at the joint MIT and Harvard Health Science and Technology program, before moving into venture, where he's had an extensive career. Kush, I believe you're currently board chair at Entrada. You are also on the boards of Insoma, GlycoEra, and probably close to a dozen other companies that you've served on in the past that have been successfully acquired or exited. And very notably, Kush and his partner, Andy, were part of an elegantly executed succession plan at 5AM Ventures 6 years ago, where they took over from the founding partners. So over to you, Kush.
Thank you, Chris. Is this on? Wonderful. We are not going to be doing introductions of our panelists because they're so well-known, esteemed leaders in our industry. This panel is the R&D panel that's been going on for many years, and it's not restricted to any particular therapeutic area, but there's so many threads and talking points that have come up over the course of today that we'll be able to pull on as we talk about R&D in general. And I'd say the actual title in the agenda is about the context of unprecedented uncertainty and also opportunity. Uncertainty is a word that we've been hearing a lot today, and a lot about change as well. And pressure and circumstances like this, we think, can be tremendous opportunities and drivers of change. So what we want to do, some rules of the road here, we want to actually really think about R&D through a couple different lenses. We talked a little bit about how the pharma business is different than early stage biotech. Those are two different worlds, highly symbiotic, but they are different. So just take a look at what perspective we're coming at with respect to R&D. And also early stage R&D, which happens in both of those worlds, and also late stage R&D. A lot of pressures that we're talking about in terms of later stage studies and the sizes and the cost of that as well. So why don't we start with all of you here have tremendous experience in our industry across large and small organizations, which is really wonderful for everyone here in the room to be hearing from. But I want to take just all these pressures they've been talking about, uncertainty, are all interconnected. Pharma and early stage biotech are both feeling pressures. I want to hear from the boardroom perspective, all right, the top-down pressures, and how that trickles down into the R&D pressures in the larger organizations today. So I want to hand it over to you, Andy, first. Maybe your own perspective, not just within the perspective of Takeda, but also all of your peers that you talk to and are in touch with as well. Tell us how that conversation goes these days.
Well, so can you hear me? Is this on? Yeah, good. No, thanks, Kush. So the question is, what's happening at a boardroom level as we're thinking about all of the pressures and uncertainty that we're facing? And I'll comment on two areas that we spend a lot of time on. I sit on the board of directors at Takeda that we spend a lot of time talking about, and that as I speak, I don't have visibility into other boards quite as much as in other settings, but I do have conversations with colleagues about what happens, and I think that these are two common themes. One is, and we have a panel coming up on AI, data, digital, and technology. And of course, that's a huge topic of conversation, but where it goes often is in workforce planning, right? Because we know that there are going to be huge disruptions to the workforce as automation comes in. How do we set our workforce up so it's not just workforce reduction, it's a transition of workforce? So that would be one. I'd be curious, Maria, what you're going to offer here. A second is, and I know we're going to talk more about China, is China. And it's interesting, it's this schizophrenic juxtaposition of, on the one hand, there's so much innovation happening in China. How do we get into China and leverage that innovation? Do we reduce the size of our research footprint here in the West and build in China? Do we in-license from China? What's that mechanism, on the one hand? Versus the other hand, given all the geopolitical risks, how do we reduce our dependency on China and remove manufacturing, remove what we need from the intermediate supply chain in China? So I would say that those would be two major topics of conversation.
Maria, your perspective through the lens of Biogen and other boards?
Biogen, Exelixis, and Alexandria, so they all have different perspectives. Well, we've been talking about uncertainty. I think uncertainty we've dealt with, as has been said before, this is whiplash. So from a board perspective, we're trying to figure out where we're going to end up and which end is up. I'm going to speak not for the board, but for myself. For me, the most important decision is capital allocation. Where we're going to put our money, what are we going to do with it? Is it going to go into developing further one particular drug? Are we going to bring in, is it a merger and acquisition situation? Is it a buyback of stock, et cetera? So it all has to do with the strategy and the planning of the company. And I find that to me is what is most exciting and perhaps most difficult. In this day and age, I think we have enormous opportunity on the R&D scope. I'm an R&D groupie, in case you don't know. I think it's fabulous to have very, very strong R&D capabilities. But having said that, sometimes the R&D is not in a company, but it's better to have a strategy for acquisition, et cetera. So I find that this is an interesting time. I find that there are opportunities out there, and it will depend on where your corporate strategy goes. But I'm bullish. I'm scared to death, but I'm bullish.
All right, I'm going to just want to unpack one topic here. We have pressures on the pharma model commercially, globally, across many different dimensions. There's a huge amount of substrate from China. Scott Gottlieb just came out with a piece this morning articulating what many of you know as well. So huge substrate of assets and programs out there. Why should pharma do early research and early development? Does pharma need that? And has that been a conversation that you think should be had? Andy?
Well, you sound like some of my commercial colleagues. Well, why don't we stop research for a couple of years so we can invest in the late stage pipeline, and then you start it up again, and that doesn't work. So I don't know. This has been the trillion-dollar question, and I'm sure you've dealt with this many times in your career, and I'd be curious, because you've bounced around, Mathai, what your thoughts are.
We're going to go to Mathai next on this.
Yeah, okay, all right. Well, I'm sorry, I'm playing moderator. I'm sorry, excuse me. But we've done the experiment in multiple different situations where we've tried to create these search and develop organizations, and the greatest failed example of that was Valiant, which was the McKinsey exercise. So it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. It doesn't mean that it can't work in the future, but I think fundamentally the complexity of making a new medicine and the way you integrate parts, you cannot solely rely on external sources. You have to have capabilities internally, and those capabilities need to be cutting edge, modern, experienced. So you have to have a research organization. I think to a T, in large pharma, the research organizations are probably oversized to where they're going to be in the future.
Mathai, from your experience at J&J and Merck as well?
You had a couple different questions in there, Kush, so let me just make 2 points. One is, you asked a question around boardrooms. I wasn't going to answer that, but it relates to what you're asking right now. I do think in larger companies, boards often have like 2-3 topics. They're saying, what's your AI strategy, or what's your IRA strategy, or and so they're looking for a strategic answer and want comfort that the commercial R&D organizations have that under control. The smaller company boards, to me, are increasingly asking, especially the investors on that board, is this company capable of an outlier outcome? And that's really different than if the entire sector were being elevated, or if all companies in an entire region were doing well. That's not a question. So they're not asking about a specific tactic or a specific thing, as you know well, but is the whole company capable of efficient investment and a truly outlier outcome? Yeah. Because the sector as a whole is not providing uniformly a great outcome. Yeah. To me, that's one of the most important pressures of recent times. Yes. And it relates to China in that, China to me is just a like a light underscoring of something that's always been the case, that as an entrepreneur, you need to feel confident that there's something about the medicine you're making that's going to offer an efficacy and or safety advantage that's a differentiated medicine in the marketplace, and B, often under-recognized, is there some reason to think that others won't do exactly the same thing? Like, what is the so-called barrier to entry? Or what is the difference? Sometimes it's as simple as having an idea way ahead of others. I sometimes use the Novartis and Entresto example as one of those, where people had proven that neprilysin inhibition was useless. So, Novartis was allowed to invest for 5, 6, 7 years before anyone kind of believed. They had phase 2 data before anyone was starting a discovery program. Or it could be intellectual property, which works in very small molecules, very small molecules. But as the molecules get larger, not so effective. Antibodies, IPs, largely not that relevant because you can work around it so easily to create an equivalent. So this whole barrier to entry thing is critically important, and there has to be some reason that your company believes that compound won't be immediately followed. We're just seeing it more right now because there's such a volume of innovation coming out of China that things that are easily knocked off are getting knocked off. But that was always true. It was true like 25 years ago. And it's just that much more true right now.
I still want to hear his answer about big pharma and research.
Oh.
Does pharma need early research and early development? I mean, it's been an inexorable
so
trend.
I do think,
right?
I mean, there are a lot of, Fiona I see sitting right there and could probably answer this better than I can. But, to me, pharma is capable of certain kinds of research that others cannot and should stick to those areas where they're particularly good. I know I can speak to the J&J organization. They became, over the years, self-aware of where they were particularly strong and would do projects in those particular areas where they had advantages. And that might change over a period of 5 years and 10 years, but they had true insight. They had data collected longitudinally over 20 years in certain autoimmune diseases. They had an ability to work within certain technologies that was very, very deep. And this is true for every pharma. But general research of the kind that could be carried out elsewhere, or where they have no particular insight and there's a special biotech company that has all the insight, they need to partner. And they need to treat the ecosystem as such. So the answer is absolutely yes. Large pharmaceuticals should continue to do research, but be selective in areas where they think they have a distinct advantage.
Please, David.
I don't know if you agree.
Just to build on that a little bit. So, shaped by a lot of time at a large biotech, and then passing through Sanofi with Andy, where I saw the problem with R&D. No, the value of R&D in those organizations, it's not the vast majority of what's acquired, I would argue, in almost any company is in-licensed, right? I mean, you start out and you have an R&D organization, and their goal is to develop a drug. They want to be state-of-the-art. They want to develop a drug. They're doing everything possible, but the odds that the drug will be developed is low. I mean, that would just say statistically. So why would you have an R&D? Because you could say, well, just percentage-wise, it doesn't make sense. You have an R&D because it gives you a much better opportunity and ability to source the external world. And that's why we all live in this ecosystem, and why this whole NIH funding and everything is such a challenging part of our industry, because it's the serendipity that happens in all those labs. And pharma, big biotech, small biotech, anybody who's trying to harvest that needs to have the expertise. And if you're not doing it's not that you have, I'm going to have 3 PhDs who are going to go out and source. That's a different thing. It's having state-of-the-art researchers who are doing cutting-edge research, who are in that community, which gives you the best chance of getting that deal. And then the second reason, as a commercial person, I want that R&D organization behind, because it's integrating us into the community in a way that you can't do if you're just cruising above it as a commercial, or you are viewed differently. And I tell our group all the time, I can sell more drug with a scientist than I can with a salesperson. And it's just, the doctors don't want you to read a label to them. They want to know what's exciting. They want to know what's next. So we're a vertically integrated business.
Yes.
And I think we need to stay that way.
So, It goes without saying that early research has been reducing within pharma. That is a trend that's been happening for a long, long time now, for the past 20, 30 years. And there will be some critical mass of research capabilities that any pharma needs to have, even if the objective is to build a pipeline of medicines that is largely derived from external partners. Okay, we can align on that. Stelios alluded to this. In a time like this, been 3 years of this kind of period, where's that innovation coming from? From small companies that are dependent on a different source of capital. And 3 years plus these past 4 months leads to what could be a multi-year period of a risk-off kind of sentiment, where there's a substantial amount of crowd. We just heard it in oncology, by the way, and that's always been the case, but even more so, crowding around precedented targets, precedented biology, precedented development paradigms, overcrowding with a limited pool of capital. There's less capital, but it's not just less. Is it qualitatively moving towards more safer bets at the expense of the true innovation that pharma is really dependent on from the early stage community? And David, you and Mathai are both running smaller companies. You're commercial now, but smaller companies, and you got there over the past number of years. What are you seeing on the front lines as leaders of innovative smaller companies, talking to the capital markets out there and investors out there? And then I will want to turn it to pharma and you, Fiona, on this topic.
Go first. So as a small company, a large company, the fundamentals don't change. I mean, I think the fundamentals got highlighted this morning. You're looking for unmet medical needs. You're looking for, solutions. You're looking for paradigms where, they can be proven in a convincing way. I mean, and as a small company in rare diseases, but as a small company, the two biggest things we're thinking about as we try to manage this is data and time. The money's secondary. You don't want to run out of money. But if you don't have data, and if you can't get to that data in a reasonable time, you die. And so, we try to manage and think about our R&D world in that way. I think, the Me Too world, and we're very clear, which is, Me Too strategy is, I'm looking for an exit, meaning I'm a small company, I have the next PD-1 or GLP-1 or whatever. I'm not looking to market that. I'm going to hope there's somebody who can be competitive in a marketing, that's a big company problem. Whereas as a small company, if I have a true unmet medical need and I have a valid solution, I can market that. I can market it into a rare disease world, I can market it into a specialty world. I'm probably not going to call on primary care physicians, but it's doable.
Mathai? You get my question? I'm asking a little bit of a different question, David, here.
That's okay. That's the one I wanted to answer.
Which is, if you're a small company doing something somewhat unprecedented, taking on a new biological risk, that is an extremely challenging place to be right now, despite all these fancy tools we have. It's extremely challenging, given what we're seeing, and it's possible, as Stelios said, right, sort of the kinds of things that were getting funded in the 2000s were not those things, actually. And we could be in that period. It could be a short blip. It could be a long period. But you got, Mathai, you're in an innovative company, private.
Yeah, we're an innovative company. We're aiming for ultimately what I believe are going to be important medicines. We're not a volume play. We have projects that are handpicked that I believe are going to be great medicines, that are going to be differentiated, durably differentiated from my previous comment. And these are certain kinds of risks that I think in the years past, say in 2021, would have been like 6 out of 10 investors, let's say, would have been interested. Now it might be 2 out of 10 investors that are interested. But I don't care if it's 6 out of 10 or 2 out of 10, as long as those 2 are actually interested. Yeah. And I'm not going to change the story to try to attract those other 4. So otherwise, a year from now, I have a major problem in that I'm out of sync with the investors in the syndicate. Yeah. So now is a time for high stringency, and from the investor side and the entrepreneur, the company side, where you have to kind of choose one another. And if you choose wrong, there's pain to be had if either party chooses wrong. There are probably fewer people out there that can see through the story and can understand that these are the steps. But I'm going to argue every day of the week that it's way better to create a durably differentiated important medicine than it is the vast majority of investments right now are going, I still think, to companies that are producing positive phase 2 data, but in areas where I'm fairly sure those are not going to be, in the end, either approved medicines or if some of them get approved, going to be important medicines, to borrow from Sam's phrase. So kind of to hold the line on things that you have true conviction in more than ever is true right now.
But the issue,
Please, Maria.
the issue is pipeline, right?
Yep.
I mean, so you can be doing all those things, and you should be doing all those things. What's coming after that, right? Who's doing the true innovation? It used to be that the government was funding a lot of that. Now we have a lot of funding for that in China. And we had other mechanisms. So during these hiatus that we were speaking before, the engine kept going because the funding kept going, and there was still innovation, as Susan pointed out, at the research universities. And I'm worried about that because where is that happening? I'm afraid we're going to lose, back to your point, Andy, of human capital. I think we're going to lose a generation of scientists if we're not careful, and I think that will be a real problem for this industry. So the issue for me is pipeline. It's not only what a small biotech can or should be doing, it's what comes after that and who's going to be the innovator.
Pharma and biotech, we've talked about. I mean, obviously there's a codependency, there's a symbiosis there. Requires a pretty vibrant biotech ecosystem. That, notwithstanding, had to be resized after what we just sort of went through, of course, and the stringency needs to be there. How can pharma, I mean, is pharma thinking about this? And Fiona, I'm looking at you right now, and I'm going to ask you right now, put you on the spot. Is this something you are thinking about? What can pharma do to ensure, as a symbiotic partner to the biotech ecosystem, that there are ways to be working and supporting the right companies, not all companies, of course, the right companies that are in this highly innovative realm where capital markets actually are really, really poorly supportive of these kinds of companies right now and could be for quite a while. Is this something you think about?
Yeah, of course.
Can we get a mic for Fiona?
I'll speak. I'll stand up. Yeah, of course we are. I mean, the whole ecosystem of academia, biotech, and pharma is a very mutually beneficial one, but has to work together for us all to succeed. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you think that pharma, let's say, at the top of the food chain, then we have to try and help our academic colleagues as well as the biotech companies. So, I mean, in the case of Novartis, we have on the one side the venture fund, mm-hmm. and there we are, digging deep, sort of continuing to fund through, things that maybe in the past you wouldn't have done, trying to do more work to bring together other investors that may be pulling out because they don't have the same sort of evergreen fund. So that's one way of helping the biotech companies. But I think the other thing is, certainly there seems to be, I would say from a business development, there's even more competition when we see good assets between us. We're always in a rush every time I'm hearing, look, there's three other bidders, we've got to move on with the due diligence. So I think there's a real willingness, and it is to fill the pipeline. So when there's good biotechs that have good assets, it's very competitive. And so we are prepared to move earlier and earlier in order to try and stay ahead of the competition, bring things in earlier, and also because of the fundraisers that some companies are doing, then the numbers of even a sort of phase 1 asset are growing higher. So then you naturally want to move earlier to maybe get something in, even though it's more risk. Yes. So yes. I think many of us are resetting our sort of risk calculations of where we're prepared to take more risk in order to get more upside at the end.
Sure.
So I think some of these crises actually do open up opportunities. They might drive more innovation, actually, yes. I think. So, yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you. I know you might have another question, a separate one later. Did you want to comment anything else on that, David? Let's go to late-stage development. I mean, it's the most cost. This costs all the money goes here. all right? And Andy needs to have a tight purse string on that, and how fast and how cheap. And where are we going to see the biggest breakthroughs in late stage development? We've talked a little trickle here of AI this, and great vignettes. They used to be theoreticals, now there's some real ones. How's it going to play out? Where's the change going to happen in the most substantive way in late stage development? Andy?
I have no idea. I mean, this is the hard
No
thing.
cop-outs here.
We were talking about this, and it's almost like it's actually getting more and more expensive. We look a lot at, Sarah was up here earlier, we look a lot at our cost per patient, and it's just getting more and more, and we're doing less and less. And we were joking that it's not even, we pay, what did you call it, government dollars? We pay like government dollars for what's that? NASA dollars for things that just, why are we paying this much money for doing such mundane activity? So that's the start of it, which is, what are we even paying for?
Yeah.
Okay, but let's just accept the fact that for some reason prices have been set in this market at this level. You know, I think we talk a lot about automation and integration of digital tools. I think that's going to help. I don't think it's going to foundationally change what we do. We talk a lot about going to regions of the world like India where cost structures are less. I think that's going to be another piece of the puzzle. I think the biggest issue is going to be regulatory reform and actually changing fundamentally how we think about what it takes to bring a drug to market, because that's ultimately what drives, that's the underpinning of our cost structure. And you know, with everything that's happening right now, you know, that, and all this word that now has been overused today, disruption, and almost inhumane activity that we're seeing, you know, we don't know what's going to come out of this. We know that today it just doesn't feel good what's happening, but maybe there's a future state where we can work together to overcome some of these barriers, because I think that's where we're going to make the big differences. Now, the other piece I'll mention, I'm sorry, I'll give it to you in a second, is China. You know, we talk about, getting back to your question originally about research internally, the dependency on external research, as you were mentioning, David, is the same today as it's always been. 70% of what comes to market doesn't originate in the labs of big pharma companies, it originates in biotech labs. That's unchanged. I think there are two factors that are now making us kind of rethink a bit our model. One is cost pressures, as we heard from Chris Viebacher and others earlier, are significantly greater as we project out over the next 5 years than what we've ever seen in our industry. So our profit margins decrease. That means less investment in R&D. And then secondly, there's a mechanism in China, not so much for development, but for bringing programs to proof of concept that's probably 75% less expensive than what we have in the rest of the world, for reasons, again, that are hard to fully explain. But that combination of huge profit pressures, and then secondly, an outlet, I think that's going to change things for us in a way that we haven't seen historically.
So that's one direction one goes in. Mathai, are you going to add?
Yeah, I mean, this is a idea that's come up and down, but I think it just needs to be dusted off right now. And that's in certain small population indications to be across, outside oncology, where it happens right now, introduce conditional approvals. And with the advent of real-world data, where it is right now, I think that is a direction that industry in cooperation with regulators globally can go. And the new administration is talking, using the right words at least along those lines. I think, as someone mentioned earlier, then that was in play, by the way, before in CEDAR, within CEDAR, is to I'm not sure about just plausible mechanism, but use of single-arm data to have conditional approvals. For large population indications, I don't think that's going to be realistic, mostly because of safety. That events, if you're going to create an Lp(a) inhibitor that's going to be used in 10+ million people in the United States alone, that's not easy to have a conditional approval, because you really do want to see that you have a safe product, and even after the fact you're collecting lots of safety, but you want a bar that's high. So scaling with the size of the population to reintroduce the conversation of conditional approvals so that you can get to market sooner and start gaining real experience. Real-world evidence, by the way, I mean, I've thought this for a long time, but just to reiterate it, is not just going to make things more efficient, but the last oncology panel was very interesting to me because, standard of care does evolve sometimes in timeframes that are faster than the clinical trial takes. So real-world data, if you have evolving standard of care or you have multiple standards of care, are going to be essential. So it's a pull in the system. Not just about saving money. So as the rigorous ways of employing data and understanding what isn't reliable, how to tune these propensity factors that are all important, how to pick the right factors even to weigh, those are going to become more and more important, and it's going to dovetail with the conditional approvals that I said, because that's how you gain confidence that there's efficacy.
I'm going to strongly suggest to do we have a regulator in the room? Anyone? We need to have someone from the FDA or other regulatory agencies in this meeting. I would propose that for the next year because there's so much dependency.
They can't
and also pardon?
They can't come.
They're not allowed. All right. Really, very recently, and I think there'll be plenty.
There are a bunch of those.
So
next year.
So I guess I'm the closest thing. I was the chair of the board, the science board for FDA. So, but that's a very scary thought right now.
No, but tell us what's possible here. What's really possible?
Well, I don't know in this universe what is possible. I think what was possible and was very profound is the ability of FDA to communicate with companies and to figure out which avenues were doable and not doable. I mean, my FDA folks kept saying to me, remember, we see all the data. Yeah. And if we tell a company don't go there, it's not because we're being mean, it's because we've seen all the other data. Yeah. So I think the interaction with regulators is critically important. What is happening now, which is a pause or a pall on the ability of regulators or even companies to be part of advisory boards, I'm not sure is well advised. So I think it is important to continue that process. And the other thing that for me, we've been talking a lot about the clinical side. I want to talk about the pre-competitive side because we don't talk about that too much. And in the R&D panel, I suspect that there's a lot that can be done pre-competitively so that we don't have to go and do the same biomarkers, that they can be, in fact, if you have a regulator in the room and says, yes, I will buy that's a good biomarker, it leapfrogs years of development. So I think we can have innovation for pre-competitive space as well.
Let's touch on that because many of you get together and gather, quite frequently about these kinds of platform collaborations and ways to work together. Hardly ever happens. Hardly ever happens in a very meaningful, substantial way. Let's talk about that. I mean, we're under these circumstances that are somewhat unprecedented for the pharma industry and for biotech. Isn't that a great driver for being bolder? And we just heard about universities reaching out to Biogen and say, let's cut through the red tape. Let's get this done. We really need to. Andy, can you speak to your experience with some of those kinds of collaborations? What's the roadblock that not just you, but everyone encounters? And can this be an action that comes out of this meeting?
So you're suggesting I'm the roadblock?
Yeah.
You are definitely the roadblock.
So actually, I hate to go back, but I want to just touch on some of the low-hanging fruit from a regulatory perspective that can significantly reduce costs. CMC requirements for filings, when you look at the different regions, they're all different. So it's not about patient safety, it's just about having different opinions as to which way. Pediatric requirements for programs, they're all different, and you pay hundreds of millions of dollars for big programs to cover all pediatric requirements for all the different regions. So just some really simple harmonization and focus on dialing up. Even some of the stuff that's being talked about, which is real around new alternative methodologies, not using animal models. I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that doesn't get at the big issue of why it costs so much per patient in a trial, but the trial costs are probably about, for a phase 3, when you look at the phase 3 cost per patient, it's probably about a third of the overall costs for bringing a drug forward. So I think if we can cut around the edges, there's a huge opportunity there. In terms of pre-competitive work, I've been involved in a ton. And we've worked together. I've worked with Fiona. I've worked with almost everybody. And I think there's a lot of goodwill, and there's been a lot of slow progress. And I don't know, just not to be dogmatic, I don't know that we're missing something here.
Okay.
I think it's just, we end up working in areas, I think that there are areas where there are standards that we should be working towards, as opposed to all of us working in different ways, standards. If we can standardize more ways of working, digital platforms for how we drive submissions, for example. But we often go to, predictive surrogate markers for Alzheimer's disease or fill in the disease. And that's disease biology that I think is very difficult to overcome.
I see. Mathai,
But
I know you
I do
worked on a
think,
lot of
and
these
this
pre-competitive platforms.
This is going to be like a little unpopular, but I think that trade organizations like Pharma, Bio have a potential big role to play in the business of the company that way, like the ecosystem. And the focus tends to be on pick the what is also an important issue, like protect price, or MFN now, or IRA.
Yeah.
And these are important, but there's the business of the ecosystem, the business of the companies that, as far as I can see, are rarely like front and center to the big organizations. Because Heber and these organizations bring together, yes, pharma, but like it's a small minority of the companies. Yes, the big companies, but it's a small minority. There may be more incentive, more desire in the mass of the companies that exist to throw in nickels or dimes to make something happen that's important for all. But it's not the focus. And those in here that are part of bio and pharma love to talk to.
Fiona, please.
Just on the public-private partnerships, I think the EU, with their innovative health, IMI, IHI, actually have done a good job in really trying to bring together companies, small, large, as well as academia, in big public-private partnerships, primarily funded by the EU for the academic groups, but then industry comes in with in-kind contributions, which is usually data or expertise. And quite often these are on biomarkers of disease or imaging. We're involved in several at the moment. And I do wonder if maybe in the US, one of the changes could be that if there's a reduction in government funding, that the government might want to incorporate more, because NIH has been very difficult to even collaborate with industry. So maybe an encouragement. Is there an opportunity to actually have an equivalent of the EU IHI where government funding funds the academic groups, but then there's also you're drawing in industry contributions and working more together like that?
Well, actually, the IMI was founded, the foundation for NIH had been carrying a lot of these public-private partnerships, and so we've had very good success and examples. ADNI, for those of you in the neurological neurosciences world, will know that this is a 25-year-old effort. Then we have had a number of others, and one that's particularly near and dear to my heart is Peter Marks came to me and said, Maria, we need to be able to do something about rare diseases, and we need to be able to do something about gene therapy. Can you help me? And at first I couldn't get anybody to come. I needed $300,000 to write the business plan. NIH said, no, I'm not interested. I went to Lilly Safra. Lilly Safra gave me $150,000. Companies gave me $150,000. We managed to pull this. And I think the last time I checked, it was like a $40 million group that got together to work on this. So it can be done. It has to be something that you care about. It's something that companies are willing to invest. And now that the dollars are so precious and few, you have to be very selective about what you start doing. But it's been done.
But clearly what I'm hearing is that the desire is strong from you R&D leaders to do this. Michael, I'd love for you to share your question.
I wanted to make a comment about conditional approvals because I'm much less optimistic that that's a viable path forward. For the following reasons, I think when people talk about it, there's a presumption that everything's going to work out, that the conditional approval is a step towards getting full approval, that the drug will perform well in terms of efficacy and safety. But if it doesn't, And the problem is severe enough that the approval is withdrawn. There's a cascade of events that are likely to happen in the United States. First, all the companies that paid, insurance companies that paid for that drug while it was being administered, will ask to have a rebate. Any patient that had a side effect of an ultimately non-approved drug may seek legal recourse. And so I think the only way to get conditional approval to be widely used is to have some legal protection for offering the drug on a conditional basis. And I'm told that there isn't a congressperson or a legislature in the United States that's willing to protect pharma companies in that way.
Mike, it happens now, right? Like lots of single-arm ORR-based approvals in oncology. It happens in certain rare diseases. I may be out of the loop, but I don't think companies are being sued all over the place. There are several notable non-confirmations that did not get full approval because the phase 3s failed. But on the whole, they look good, and they offered early access. So there are certain, I think, criteria for where you'd even try, that the unmet need needs to be severe, and the sort of the pull of the market needs to be high. And there has to be some practical reasons why a randomized study would take a lot longer or would be difficult. But there are lots of cases like that. So, you know, I could be missing some aspect of litigation that's ongoing, but I don't see companies getting sued for those non-confirmations.
Well, I think for rare disease and cancer, maybe
Oh, okay.
No, but I think that's the issue,
But,
right? It's just,
yeah.
we're trying to develop a regulatory toolbox and not where, okay, conditional approvals are possible, so everybody wants conditional approval because I can get my drug approved and I can start making money. It's just, I mean, the whole regulatory framework, it's a risk-benefit assessment. I think ultimately, every disease is different, particularly in rare disease. You've seen one. And precision medicines, I think the challenge for us as an industry is I think we are trying to move to a place where 100% of the people who get our drugs respond. And if that's a world, then I can make a risk benefit. I require fewer patients from a safety standpoint because I'm not trying to create a safe world for the 50% that aren't going to respond, kind of thing. So I just think the opportunities we pursue and the models that are going to be successful are going to be driven by that. And the regulatory framework is going to have a basket of tools, and how those tools get used is going to be determined by the person sitting in front of you, not a monolithic FDA or other regulatory agency.
Rapid fire. Go ahead,
I
Andy.
want to state the
You're
obvious,
MC.
which is that it's also not just a scientific benefit risk assessment, it's a political benefit risk assessment. Ultimately,
enough.
what are we
Fair enough.
willing, it is. Well, it's always been that way, actually. You have appointees that are political appointees. The question is how much they will leverage their authority in driving decision
So for
making.
the highly visible, but I will say for the 90% of things that are going through, it's my junior reviewer who's 3 years out of training.
Historically, you're right. I mean, I think that but there are two issues that I think are challenges with conditional approvals. One is that our reimbursement system is completely separated from our regulatory system. So you get approved conditionally for something that you don't know if it works, and if it's a rare disease, you pay $1 million for it. That's a problem in many ways, including politically, if ultimately the drug doesn't work. And the second, and we're starting to overcome this in oncology, is that sponsors are reluctant after they have approval to do anything after the approval that might show that the drug actually isn't working.
We're going to wrap up with a rapid fire question for each of you. We're in a crucible of change right now. We've just talked about that. What is the most positive thing and positive change that will come out of this time of great pressure for our industry?
I'll start. I think that
I gave you guys a heads up, so go for it.
I think aggregation of talent. I think with the number of companies potentially coming down a little bit, we're going to see the kind of concentration of talent that's critical for companies to be very successful.
Great.
Solidarity. It's so rare to see our industry come together in a positive and productive way. Chris was saying that pharma, for the first time ever, not that they're the definition of solidarity, for the first time ever, met on a Sunday. right? Because we have a shared interest. And it's actually not just because we're being challenged from an economic standpoint and financially. It's because the future of our mission is being challenged.
Well said.
I think we're going to see a revolution on how we do, how we go about doing our business. I think it's going to change in many fundamental ways, and we're going to look back at this time and say, it's like we look at the pandemic, for example.
Paradoxically, I think people are going to finally get a greater understanding of our business and how it works. Up until now, I think they haven't had. When things start getting a little bit bad, suddenly you start looking at it in a different way. That'll be good for us.
Fair enough. On that note, wonderful. Thank you so much to all of you. Thanks a lot, Dave.